that should go to Jim's email then.
Okay. Well, welcome, guys. I'm going to sort of just tell us what we're going to try to talk about today, and then I'll open us in order of prayer, and then we'll get going. Way back in the very first week, we talked about this idea, sort of maybe a false idea, but an idea that we have sort of collectively, that most of us are well, and that there's some of us who are struggling with some mental illness. And we talked about how a pandemic sort of level set that, how all of a sudden we were all struggling in ways that were uniquely ours as people, but pretty universal in some of the themes. And so today we're going to talk about trauma and the impact that trauma has on us. And trauma is also one of those things that, two things about it. One is that it's pretty universal. People have traumatic experiences, and sometimes we don't realize it because it doesn't feel big enough, or we don't notice it. But it also impacts us in really big ways. And so what we're trying to do today is to sort of talk through what trauma is and how it impacts us, and then also maybe to reflect on the fact that a pandemic also is a very traumatic experience. And we've experienced that in our own ways in our own lives, but also we share a lot of that experience of the impact that a pandemic has on us. And so then we're going to try to land on how do we be very intentionally, both individually, intentionally on wellness in the face of trauma that lands on us, and also how do we do that collectively. So that's what we're gonna try to cover in our conversation together. Let me open some word of prayer, and then we'll get going. Dear Father, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for this class and the chance to talk through some things that sometimes are hard for us to understand, sometimes are hard for us to talk about. And you call us together as a body of believers to be in each other's lives. And so it's good for us to talk together about these things. And so we'd ask that you bless our conversation together, and that we will learn from each other, and that we will also leave our conversation with some ideas about how we can be deliberate and intentional about our own wellness, and also about caring for each other. We ask all this in the name of your Son. Amen. So I was saying in prepping for this week, I have that short little attention span, so I end up chasing down rabbit holes on Google. And I was reading this scientific journal that there was no chance that I was going to understand about how the brain works in very complex ways. And it took me back to this verse, that I am fearfully and wonderfully made. I don't understand the science of much of it. I'm pretty sure actually that my brain is actually a squirrel that runs on a wheel, and it has a pulled hamstring. But the rest of you have a very complex, the brain is a very complex organ. And when we experience trauma, our brain does amazing things to help us through that. And it impacts us in ways that are pretty far reaching. Also, so just for an example, I don't know if Jonathan Leiser is in the room. After the class, you can talk to Jonathan Leiser. He's the one who understands all of this medical stuff. But if you look at tears underneath an electron microscope, I don't know what Friday night pizza and beer party somebody came up with that idea. But if you look at tears under electron microscope, they structurally look different. So tears of happiness look really different from tears coming from grief. And then when they studied the tears of grief, they actually have proteins in them that your brain generates when you're feeling pain, as a way to sort of numb that pain or deaden that pain. So your tears are actually working on helping you through your grief. That's how complex we are made. And so we're going to talk a little bit, the first part, just about what happens to us when we experience trauma, and what's our body's response to it, what's our mind's response to it, and how that lands on us. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how do we, knowing that, how do we work on wellness? This is a really busy slide, and jump in here wherever, Jeff. This is a really busy slide, but the thing that I want you to know about in this slide is that there's small t trauma and big T trauma. And oftentimes when we think of trauma, or we think of post-traumatic stress disorder, which is now something that we sort of use in our vocabulary, we're thinking about really, really big things. somebody dies in a car accident, or we think of soldiers in combat who experience life and death situations, and their best friend dies in an IED explosion. And so we think of these really, really big life events, and we think that those are the things that create trauma. And we think less about some of the small T traumas, which is really just experiences that are overwhelming to us. And particularly when we're exposed a little bit over time. So, there's that saying about death of 1,000 paper cuts or whatever. It's this little things that we don't necessarily notice, but there are events that do impact us, and they sort of have a cumulative effect on us over time. And you see that bottom, sort of just the idea of prolonged stress. So many of us, because we think in terms of the big T trauma, we say, well, I'm okay because I haven't had those really big things happen to me. And it makes sense. It makes sense to me that when somebody else experiences something big like that, I look at that and I say, well, I understand why they would be struggling, because they had this thing that's really hard for them to get past. But we don't pay attention to some of those small teeth trauma because they don't seem big enough to be alarming to us. And so we don't necessarily either give other people credit for having experienced those things and struggling as a result of it, or pay attention to it when we've gone through that a little bit. A couple of weeks ago, when I talked a little bit about myself, my own story, I talked about sort of the idea of being barnacled, like things just sort of stick to you over time, and it impacts you. But because you don't, at least I didn't pay attention to each little one as significant, I just sort of didn't attend to it, and it sort of it had an accumulative effect on me that was really a trauma response that I didn't quite understand at the time. Jess, do you have anything you want to throw in there?
No, you're crushing it.
Okay. So this is what I said, that I read some sort of scientific journal that I didn't quite understand. And so I decided to quote it so that you would know I really did the homework, even though I still don't quite understand it. But there's a couple things that happen in your brain when you are exposed to traumatic events. And if you think about the last slide, I know I just moved on from it, but those things that come up with it, that make up the small T traumas, they're really personal. So I might experience a couple of these things and not have any really response at all, where you might experience some of those things and it just lands on you hard. It has to do with your personal makeup. It has to do with your support system. It has to do with your own sort of the things that are in your resiliency toolbox, the things that help you bounce back. There's your demeanor. There's lots of things that go into how we individually respond to that cluster, that series of small T traumas. So it is pretty individual.
Last week we talked about the backpack. Everyone's already carrying about a certain weight for them. So how we receive new weight is often sort of leans into how heavy is the weight that you're already carrying, how you're impacted by something new, even when it's small, can have a really significant impact if that's the piece that suddenly made the bag just too heavy.
Yeah, that's a good connection. And it is an example of just how personal this is. Because we are fearfully and wonderfully made, this is what happens when we are exposed to traumatic things. I like the word, I want to pull out the word of a cascade. There's just this chain reaction of things that happens in us that we don't even know about. And lots of them are physical and biological, and they're stress responses. Your body wants to take care of you, and it senses that something is threatening you. And so it does a lot of things to protect you. And so these things, the limbic system, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, these are the things that control things like heart rate, your pulse, your just the way your body handles something if you're in that sort of fight and flight mode. And then things also get sort of triggered in terms of the way your brain actually responds to the moment. So the big idea in this, and like I said, you can see Jonathan Weiser after class, and he'll unpack all of those things for you. But the really big idea is that your brain is trying to protect you, and that only works a little bit. It doesn't work a lot, but it's designed to help you in that exact moment. One of the examples, sort of a similar example that I use is when I was 35, I was diagnosed with a weak heart, cardiomyopathy, and it had to do with a virus, and I got better. But one of the things that your body does when you have a weak heart and you're not pumping enough blood around, is your heart actually grows bigger. And it does that because your body needs more blood and oxygen. And so it's trying to fix that. And so by getting bigger, it's more volume that it gets to pump around your body. The problem is that when your heart grows bigger, it actually gets weaker. It's already weak and it actually grows weaker. So the process that it's trying to help you through is good on the short run. It's good for today and tomorrow. It's not good for a year from now. And so this is kind of the same thing. Your brain is trying to protect you in this moment, but it doesn't help you over the course of your lifetime or the next year.
So big takeaway there is that our exposure to and experiences of hard things does have a very physical impact on us. And the happy part of that is that when we're going through hard things, there can be a very physical intervention around it.
I didn't put this in our slide deck, but there's a thing called the ACEs study, which is
adverse childhood experiences.
Thank you. And what they did is they just looked at people, and this is a huge study, a ginormous study, and they looked at people and just asked them questions about things that they might have been exposed to in their childhood. And some of them were those big T traumas, but some of them were just sort of everyday hard life things. Divorce in a family, or lots of fighting in a family, or moving a lot, or just these things that sort of happen to us that we don't really consider to be life-altering events. There might be hard days, but you sort of suck it up and move on. And what they discovered was that there's a huge correlation between having those experiences, being exposed to adverse childhood experiences, and all sorts of chronic physical, biological, medical problems. And so heart disease, cancers, just things that we just thought were biological things, or actually have a root in these adverse experiences. And it's because your body is responding to all these things in ways that seem protective in the moment, but are not good for your health over the long range, the long period of time. And it's also related to all sorts of behavior things. So people ending up in jail, substance use, smoking, just all sorts of behavioral things that happen in people's lives also have a great correlation with those adverse childhood experiences.
And just sort of run of the mill for sort of everyday us, symptoms of depression and anxiety.
So here's just some takeaways about the impact of trauma or traumatic events, or exposure to traumatic events, even small T trauma over time. It's upstream to a lot of the problems that we see. And so some of that, and so Jess just mentioned, we mentioned physical and biological things. Jess just mentioned things like depression and anxiety, and those things that would show up as manifestations of mental illness. Oftentimes even bigger things of mental illness. I have a colleague and a friend who has heard voices ever since she was about a teenager. She's been in and out. She's 70 right now, and she's been in and out of state institutions. She spent her whole life as a person who received mental health services. And what she finally came to understand was that all of what she experienced, including these really big symptoms of a major mental illness of schizophrenia that was labeled schizophrenia, all stemmed from some significant childhood abuse that she suffered at the hands of people who were supposed to care for her and love her. And so connecting some dots between those early experiences of hers and the symptoms that she actually experienced, her brain was trying for years to sort of compensate, to overcome those experiences that she had. And what showed up was things that got diagnosed and then treated without necessarily the recognition that they had an upstream the cause, and that was rooted in trauma. So there's lots of hidden things that happen that impact people, and they show up as behavior problems or mental health issues, symptoms of mental illness, and really there's a sort of a universal underlying of trauma. The second thing is the way our brain manages trauma makes it hard for us to know this stuff. So when I, in one of those big words in that last slide about sort of all the medical stuff, the front part of your brain, which is the part that talks about important things and concepts and does math and all those things, that shuts down when you're experiencing trauma so that you can focus on not dying today. That's sort of what your brain's trying to do. And it stores all those things in the center part of our brain, the amygdala and our cortex. And it's also stored, the memory of trauma is stored in a different part of the brain. It's a part of the brain that doesn't have language. It's not where words come from. So your recent memory, or your memory of your favorite vacation with the sunset a certain way and the clouds a certain color and the seagull over the water, you can talk in great detail about those things because your brain is storing that memory in part of the brain that has words, because it wants you to remember in great detail that happy thought. The car accident or the 100 of little t traumas get stored in a part of your brain that doesn't have memory, because it can't be bothered by processing. It just needs to remember that thing and stay away from it or run from it. And so when we will be startled by something that triggers a response or triggers a remembrance, it's a sense, it's a feeling, it's something you smell, it's something that you hear, it's a song, it's something that your brain associates with a traumatic thing, but that's stored in such a way that you will remember it quickly and act quickly without thinking about it. What that means is when we say to you, or I say to you, sort of, tell me what happened, you might not know exactly why it is you're feeling the way you're feeling. All of a sudden, out of the blue, Mark is irritable and he's angry and he's lashing out at his family. And it has to do with something that he's remembering, only he doesn't have words for it, because the way he's remembering it is designed not to have therapy. It's designed to keep Mark safe today. And so, like I said, our brain responds in a way that's kind of miraculous, but it doesn't help us in the long term. It doesn't help us build good relationships with the people around us and that kind of thing. So number 2 and number 3, it makes us hard to understand. It makes it hard to understand and talk about. And yet that's what we ask people to do. Tell me what's wrong. I don't know what's wrong. Only I'm just really, really upset right now and I can't put my finger on it. And then it shows up like all sorts of things. We served a guy in Access for years. He lived with Brenda and I for about a year, and this was decades ago, but some of you might remember we brought him to church a little bit. He had an intellectual disability, and he was in trouble all the time, just all the time. And people would say, Robert, what were you thinking? And I realized he wasn't thinking. He was feeling. And once we realized that, I started to say to him, I don't know what the feeling is, but something is connected. I think that something you're feeling now is connected to something you were feeling long ago. And when we started, we decided we were going to be detectives and try to figure that out. And when we started to do that, things started to make sense. And he would remember things, be able to talk about them. He used to carry around these little dollar store handcuffs, and he would threaten to handcuff you. And when he was upset and we couldn't figure it out. And then one day, just out of the blue, he remembered that he had been handcuffed regularly in a bathtub of cold water for like a whole day. And so he didn't know that. He didn't know that was why he wanted to carry around the dollar store handcuffs. But it was really connected directly to something that he had experienced that he had stored in a part of his brain that didn't have good recall around words. And so finally it spilled out one day, and we were able to start working on what that meant. But if you carry handcuffs, then you can't be handcuffed because you're carrying them, and you can protect yourself around something that. And so he would have a feeling of fear. He didn't know where it came from, but it was associated with fear that he had felt as a child. So that's an example of how sort of all works for us. When we know this, and I just sort of gave you an example of that, we learn to say what happened rather than what's wrong with you. People had asked Robert for decades, what's wrong with you? And we realized it was just that he couldn't remember or couldn't talk about some things that were really bad and that would make any of us a little bit unable to manage some hard things. So that brings us to, where are we in time? That brings us to sort of trauma and wellness. And we want to talk about a couple of concepts here: self-care, metabolism, integration, and then sort of end on this idea of community care. And Jess has said one of the things that goes into wellness, and we'll land on this a little bit in a couple of minutes, is that the connection between our mind and our emotion and our physical body is really deep. And so some of the wellness that we do has to do with taking care of our physical being, even though we might think that isn't connected to my mood, or it's not connected to my emotional well-being. All of the parts of us are really, really intricately interwoven. And so there's wellness strategies that we'd say, well, I don't understand how that's connected, but it is. So I want to just sort of spend a couple of minutes sort of talking through these concepts of self-care, metabolism, and integration. So
as we sort of head into this, Mark, too, I just want to also point out how this affects everybody. That anytime, if we look super simply at what is trauma, we're really talking about anytime your brain becomes overwhelmed. And anytime your brain becomes overwhelmed by something unexpected, that's something that we didn't feel prepared for, we have that physical reaction. Changes in the limbic system, the cortisol releases, and that becomes deleterious over time to us, which Mark has unpacked. So this is something that we're all experiencing. We started having this conversation at Access a bunch of years ago because we have some program spaces where we're putting staff in front of a lot of trauma that is other people's trauma. We refer to that as like secondary trauma, or you may have heard vicarious trauma, the exposure to material that isn't maybe necessarily your experience, but just by being exposed to it has an effect on you. And so we started wondering, what do we do to care for our staff to help them figure out how to manage that in a way that doesn't just become deleterious to them, but actually challenges their growth and development, makes them even more effective. So that's kind of where some of these thoughts around then how do we actually process trauma of any kind in a way that's growth minded.
Yep. So how are we each managing the trauma of a pandemic plus the trauma of life that goes on anyway on top of a pandemic? So we're going to unpack these just for the next couple minutes and then leave with some ideas of what we might want to do, each of us, to implement something or to put something in place. One of the things that I've noticed, I think you probably have too, is just the self-care, the word self-care, the term self-care has become sort of a buzzword in the last couple of years. And it makes sense because we're all universally struggling with hard times. If we think about, and feel free to just shout something out or put it in the chat, but if you think about the things that you do when somebody says, hey, what are you doing to take care of yourself this weekend? Or what sort of self-care things are you doing? It might be, we find ourselves watching Netflix or binge watching something, or, there's the chocolate, the box of chocolates, or the ice cream out of the tub with a spoon in it, or a glass of wine, or just what are the those things that we bubble bath. We think of things that we do to soothe and distract us, and those are really important things. When we're having a really long day or a really long week, we get away. Or somebody saying, well, I'm going to get away for the weekend. I'm going to go to, to a movie. I'm going to go to a hotel for, go out of town for a weekend. Those are really important things that we do. What they do is they soothe and distract us from the things that feel a little bit overwhelming to us, and we get away from them for a minute. So what it's good for is it helps us take a break. The problem with that is if that's the only tool you have then really what you end up doing is you just avoid the hard things over time. And you can't be well. You can't land on personal wellness by avoiding. You have to actually act on it very specifically in order to get wellness. So I think when I just watch what's happening out there, I think, well, it's good that people have ways of taking care of themselves. It's not good if that's the only tool that they have, and we need, and so what Jess has just said about how we've talked to our staff has been saying, so notice what you're doing for self-care, but then also know that you have to take some other steps in order to, manage your own personal wellness. So that brings us to the next thing, which is the metabolism, which is when we actually pay attention to it. I use the word lean in. Sometimes that feels like a buzzword, but what it means is we have to actually pay attention to it. What is it I'm feeling? What is that feeling about? Do I have an idea where that feeling came from? What's it connected to? How is this experience that I'm having right now? How is it landing on me? What's it doing to me? And so noticing it and naming it and saying, yeah, this is what's going on for me.
And this is really hard. And this is a space where I don't think that we spend enough time teaching ourselves and our children how to do this. It's really moving into pain. And we spend a great deal of time and attention trying to figure out how to get away from pain. But in fact, the resolution to it is usually a traveling through. And there's so much discomfort in those spaces. And, I think when we think about grief, we've been walking a little bit of a grief journey this week at work. And when we think about grief, and I know so many of us here in the conversation have carried some really heavy, life-changing grief, it's really hard to hold it all at once. It can be too much, too heavy, that we have to have those pauses. So when we talk about things like self-care, the pause, I think we're created in a way where even our bodies create a numbing for us in space where we can only digest as much as we physically and mentally, emotionally are capable of digesting. And happily, we get pieces of that we can handle and we digest over time. There are a lot of people that we've seen and you've seen, and we've all done it ourselves, where we try really hard to avoid that discomfort, but it chases us down. It plays itself out in other ways, often behavior we wish we weren't engaging, like negative relational interactions, arguments, the crankiness that Mark mentioned earlier, all the ways where we can see maybe we're not keeping up with being in those difficult spaces, and you see it coming out maybe a little bit sideways.
So I just want to sort of stay here for just a second. Jess mentioned that we're having a hard week at Access. We lost 2 staff members this week. Both of them were in the wellness video, actually. Jeff, who you saw in the wellness video, and Wendy. Jeff passed away very suddenly, very unexpectedly on Monday of some medical things that we're not entirely sure of yet. He was 47, and just nobody thought that was going to happen. So it was a sudden, sharp loss. Wendy had been battling cancer for a couple of years and had finally just reached sort of the end of her battle, and she went off life support and passed away last night. And so we have this whole week been spending time with staff saying, how do we help each other metabolize this? What do we do to notice how it's impacting us and what's going on? And then how do we very intentionally notice it and name it, and then act on it, like how not only for ourselves, what do you do for yourself, but what do you do with other people? So I'll just use myself as an example. So lots of you know that Brenda has been through cancer and she's survived it. But when I think of Wendy and Wendy's passing, the other day when I was told this news that she was going on off of life support, I knew that what was going to happen next was I was going to remember stuff. And so we mentioned at the beginning that these memories aren't stored in places where language happens. They're images, and they're very real. It feels very vivid. but I knew that those things were going to come back to me. And I could have said, well, I don't have time for that, or I don't want that discomfort. I knew that it would bring back something uncomfortable. And so I could have said, well, I'm going to just go for a run, or I don't run. Actually, I wouldn't say that, but I go for a hike, or I'm going to go do something to sort of get my mind off of it. But what I said instead was, I got in my truck and I just drove, and I said, well, I have some time. I'm just going to go ahead and remember. And so I remembered several Februaries when Brenda was in chemo, and what that was like and how hard it was to go through those periods of time with her. Not only what she was dealing with, but what I was dealing with as a caregiver. And I just sort of remembered those feelings and remembered that hardship and said, this is coming to me because I just found out news about somebody who's dying of cancer in February. It's just, this is the way it's going to land on me. And so I sort of honored it and respected it. I didn't wallow in it. I said, I drove my truck home, got out of it and said, okay, well, I'm going to go eat dinner and go on with things. But I didn't know to do any of that until relatively recently in my life, and the last, half a decade or maybe a little bit more. But that's what we're talking about in terms of metabolism, is just really understanding and naming out loud. I did some of that by myself. It's important that we do it with other people as well. So some of us are going to meet today, and just sort of remember Wendy, and remember, and the conversation will take its own course, but we'll be around each other, and that's part of the community care, which we'll talk about in a minute.
And just that word notice, I think, is really important. My own experience this week has been full of noticing. How am I experiencing this? And we have a great deal of responsibility around how we also care for other people. So we've created space where other people can come together with intention to feel. And, we could, as an employer, just say, everyone take PTO, go take the day off, go away. But instead, we wanted to come together. We wanted to create role model, moving into the pain and being in it together, naming those things, not being vulnerable together, not being afraid to show what that pain looked like. But then that's very collective. Then there's private management and what you notice in yourself. And for me, there was a busy week of a lot of taking care of pieces. And so I know what are my signs when I'm struggling and it's tired and it's cranky and becoming impatient. So I can notice those things, because that then gives me the opportunity to do something about it. And I think that's the value of metabolism, is really, it's paying attention, saying, what is happening to me? What am I experiencing? Because then you have the opportunity to address it. But if you choose not to notice and you just sort of plow through, you're not giving yourself any of those opportunities. And the addressing it piece can actually be really simple. In fact, usually it is really simple. It's taking the pause. It's listening to that song intentionally. It's allowing yourself to have 5 or 10 minutes of, if it's private, crying, sitting and thinking, attending to, but they're usually not huge, big interventions. And I think sometimes we think, I don't have time for this. I don't have time to grieve. I don't have time to give myself space about this really hard, difficult thing, when in fact, the interventions that we require are often a pause. It's a moment, it's 5 minutes, it's an intentional conversation that gives us the opportunity to notice and experience, and then name what we're walking through.
Just one last piece, and we'll go to integration now, but one last piece of metabolism. Recently, I did one of those sort of Google searches to unpack what metabolism is in a scientific way. We kind of know it as you figure out you're breaking things down, or you're addressing something. But metabolism in its scientific word really does 3 things. And again, this is Mark's non-scientific paraphrase of it, but it turns into energy, and then it's turning something into energy. It's creating something that's the building blocks for something else that you need. And then the third thing is it gets rid of waste. And so one of the things I've started to do is to say, so as I reflect on this and how it's landing on me, what action, what energy, what action can I do that will sort of move me forward in a positive way? What thing am I learning that's important to me? And I might not know the answer right then, but it helps me focus a little bit. How is this experience? What is it teaching me about something, or what can I use this experience for in a good way? And then what thing is this that I need to just let go of? Like, what thing do I just need to let pass? And that helps me just sort of notice it but notice that in a positive way, and then sort of move on in some way. So I actually found myself in an series of interviews later in the week. And before the interviews, I was trying to get my head around what were some good questions to ask in this interview. And I found myself saying, I always loved Jeff's perspective on just the work and what it was about. I wonder what questions Jeff would ask in an interview. And people had talked about being interviewed by him for a job, and how he always asked some really just sort of plain human questions that helped get at who you were as a person. And so that's an example. I deliberately said, I wonder how my experience with Jeff this week plays out in how I do my job. And so, I took that thought into an interview with me. So it as Jess has said, it's not rocket science, but it is deliberate and it's intentional, and it's not the thing we sort of want to do in a moment necessarily, because it does involve some level of discomfort. Let's talk about integration. Jess, you want to just talk about that for a minute with the boxes in the attic, and
Sure.
and then we'll sort of land the plane there.
Yeah, we use them, like all things, especially Mark and I, a metaphor. And our metaphor for is, we have this sort of idea of an attic. We all have an attic. Not everybody has an attic, but literally in your house. Some people don't have an attic, but it's sort of the storage area, and it's where you put your crap. And some people are Rubbermaid people. I'm not. I'm usually pretty proud if I can get something into a box. And inevitably in my attic, there's a box book sitting on top of like a hat and scarf book. And the hat and scarf book is now half the size of how tall the box used to be. So, we all sort of have this metaphorical attic where we store our stuff, the sort of accumulated parts of us, our life story, all the accumulated great things, the big wins, the great stories, the beautiful relationships, and as well as the hard things, the difficult moments, the losses and obstacles, the traumas, the big T1s and the little T1s, all sort of put together in boxes like file folders. And roughly in an attic, we kind of know where things are. I can find that hat and scarf box because it's halfway crushed. And I know where the books are. And when we are metabolizing, we're very much sort of taking this information and traveling up to the attic and filing it in the box where it makes the most sense. And here's my grief box, or here's my history of abuse box, or here's my difficult relationships box. And we sort of file it there. Integration is really just the maintenance of a moderately organized attic. And again, not the Rubbermaid people, but sort of just, there's the boxes up there, and I mostly know where I can find things. And I think in the matter of course for us, development is sort of, I noticed a really disorganized box that needs my attention. I need to go up and do some work in there. And I think that's operating out of our integrity. It's sort of emotionally and mentally responsible, that when we know we're kind of bleeding out in a certain box, I open this up, everything flew out. That's a space where we need to take some time and attention to organize, because it allows us to be even more effective in our relationships and in our responsibilities and roles across our life. But integration is very much the fabric of us. It's the story of us. It's all the parts woven together to make us the beautiful tapestry that we are. And when we metabolize well, we weave that new thread into the fabric of us in a way that can be really impactful. That when we choose not to metabolize, or when we avoid, we miss the opportunity to take what these experiences offer us to make us stronger. One of the things that we talked about all week, and it was sadly ironic, Jeff and Wendy both were extremely strong in their genuine presence with people. and out of their capacity to just love well. And they were incredibly engaging and supportive to our staff. They both taught and mentored other people and to the people that we serve. And for both of them, that capacity to be so effective came out of their own lived experiences. It came out of their own integrated selves. They were both people, and you heard them a little bit on the video, who were very clear about the integration of their life experiences. And they used the clarity that they gained out of their own careful metabolism, weaving into the integration of themselves to act out of that space in a way that made them just impactful with other people. We have that opportunity as well in all of our difficult spots, and we know it because when we come alongside someone else in the context of community, we lean into our own experiences to do that. Our ability to be vulnerable and authentic when we come alongside another person to say, I see you because I can relate to some of this and I'm willing to share it with you is very powerful.
Nice, thanks. Two slides left. I'm gonna just really briefly talk about this. We're sort of out of time, but so being outside is one of my tools of wellness, and it helps me physically, but it also helps me settle and it puts me in an emotionally good space most of the time. So, but this slide here is just about how I am outside intentionally. So Jess just talked about sort of the intentionality of integration. So the slide on the left is I forget how old Luna was. This is Luna, my granddaughter, and this was a hard day. I had back-to-back meetings. It doesn't look hard in that moment, but it was because I took a break. So this is self-care on the left. It's just me taking a hike for an hour on the Perkiomen Trail between meetings so that I could just sort of take a break from my day and go back sort of a little bit refreshed for the afternoon. The middle two slides, the slide here and then on the top, have to do with the death of a homeless woman that I had gotten to know pretty well. She died in a flood 2 summers ago, and it was my process. Another time I'll tell the story in greater depth, but it was my process to sit in this space where I found out that she had passed away and just spend those moments sort of metabolizing that. Thinking about it, reflecting on her life. And then I took a rock from this spot, this rock right here, it's a piece of quartz, and I put it in the wall. 2 weeks before she died, she and I sat on top of this wall right in this spot, and we talked about her life and what had gotten her to be homeless and her dreams for moving past that and sort of hopes for a better future. And so I put that rock in there and just sort of spent some time, and I revisit it. I go back there from time to time just to remember her and remember a life that she worked hard on, even though she had some adversity. And then this bottom, this is Cape Henlopen, which is a space where I like to return to, and this is the integration spot. This is where I go and I reflect about how things have been over time, and I think about how God has cared for me, or people in my life have cared for me, and how it gives me a bigger perspective of my life is okay, even though when there's some hard moments. So we're metabolizing is sort of how we process things in a moment. Integration is sort of how we get a perspective, the bigger view of what's going on, and I sort of return to sort of the spiritual aspect of how God has cared for me over time. It's also a physical space that takes me back and reminds me of time having passed and care over time. So the reason I show that is simply because it's the way I try to do things on purpose. You need to find something that you do on purpose, that in each of those things, something that you do to manage your day and soothe yourself, distract yourself, something that you do that helps you metabolize what's happening to you as it's happening. And then also something that you do to get a step back and get the longer sense of. I just want to touch on this for a second. And this is the idea of community care, which is a really big thing in the service world. The world is coming to understand that we don't all walk this alone, and that we have to create spaces where people take care of each other. And there are people who do this internationally There's people who do this in places like refugee camps and places in hard spaces in the world where people are really struggling hard. And that what they realize is the power of the community to promote wellness in individuals, that we're not doing this alone. And so we could spend more time on this. We're out of time, but I want to just point to us that we already know to do this. As Christians, we're called to be in community. And so there's a couple verses here that just tell us about something we already know something about, but I'm hoping that that we have a renewed sense today, that not only do we have a sense of it, but we are really called to do that. And so when we've had this theme of moving towards somebody and sitting with them and getting help if we need to, that this is really what we're called to do. And it means that sometimes we're going to all be in a space that feels uncomfortable, but when we metabolize and integrate it, we can get through it pretty well. Last thoughts, Jess?
There was a point this week where, in speaking to a group of people who were now carrying grief, we talked about everybody has their own grief that we have to carry. It's ours. We can only carry ours. We can't carry the grief of Jeff's family members or Wendy's family members. We're only called to carry our. But when we walk next to each other carrying that grief, it's a lot easier to do. And just sort of coming back to that idea of community, which it's the thread that has been consistent through all of our weeks, is connecting together around our shared experiences, being willing to share them, giving permission for someone else to share back, makes it easier to carry what we have on our plate or in our backpack.
And sometimes, I was in several different groups this week, and several of them were very intentional. They were very planned. People had thought about it. I listened to Jess say some words that she had thought about, and had intended to say to a group. I also sat in groups where people didn't know what to say. There wasn't much to say. They just sort of came together very organically because they were all sad. And they just wanted to be in the presence of somebody else who was sad. And there was tissues got passed around, and the conversation happened. The conversation went where it needed to go. And so I want to encourage us, because again, we heard early on that sometimes we are afraid to talk or to sit with somebody in the space because we're afraid that we don't have the right words. And oftentimes the thing that's most powerful, the thing that's most healing, is really the presence that we have with each other. It's not the words that we feel inadequate to craft in that moment. And so I want to just end this by saying, trauma happens to all of us. We need to move towards each other and ask each other how we're doing, and realize that when we do that, that creates a little bit of vulnerability because we don't honestly know what to say next. And that's okay. We don't have to. Even though it feels uncomfortable, it's very powerful, and it's the way God created us to be. So let me just quickly close this in prayer, and then we'll get into our day. Heavenly Father, we thank you that we are fearfully and wonderfully made, and we thank you that you created us as complex beings who can live through hardship. And we also know that sometimes it feels very overwhelming to us, and that leads to all sorts of challenges and problems for us as individuals. We thank you that we were born to be in community, that we were created to be in community. And we'd ask that you will just help us to renew our sense of how to care for each other well in hard times, certainly in times like these, in times of a pandemic, and then also times when life happens as it does anyway. And so we'd just ask that you will continue to help us to live well with each other. We ask all this in the name of your Son. Amen. All right, guys, thanks. Recording, stop.